Welcome, class. This video will help you do the interview with the school psychologist or counselor assignment. Everything we're going to be looking at here is located in the major assignments folder. If you click on that, you'll see the very first folder listed in that is the interview with the school counselor or school psychologist. If you click on that folder, you'll be taken to the instructions and the link to submit. At the top, you'll notice a link that says Instructions and Rubrics. We'll be going through that paper, that file here. The table that you see in the middle is actually the link to submit your draft, which we'll be talking about. And the link at the bottom is your final paper and reflection. Let's open up the instructions and view them. First of all, this assignment is worth 20% of your grade. It's due, the draft is due on February 28th, and the final is due 2 weeks later on March 14th. This assignment may be submitted up to a week late with a 10% point deduction. And it may be revised, the final paper may be revised for up to a week after it's graded. How does this assignment work? Well, first of all, you'll need to locate a school psychologist or a school counselor. The purpose of this is to help you, first of all, understand how they work with students and families, and also to give you some insights as to the social, emotional, and academic issues that adolescents deal with. You can conduct this interview in person, over Zoom, or by telephone. The individual you interview should be currently practicing in one or more schools. They should not be someone who's retired. It's important to note that you may not interview a classroom teacher for this activity because they don't do the same thing as a counselor. The school psychologist or counselor should work with adolescent students, not elementary students, to match your area of certification. You might try calling your old school, your old middle school or high school. If you have connections with a school, call them. But if all else fails, call schools, because most schools will let you at least talk to someone over the telephone for a half hour. Your paper should contain a minimum of 3 citations and 1 or more matching references in APA format. Since we've learned how to do that, I will be checking to see that your references and citations are formatted correctly. You may use your textbook or you may use websites as long as they are reputable websites. Make sure your paper is well written, double-spaced, properly organized. Make sure it contains a title page, page numbers, headings, as this will be a part of your grade. Here are the topics that you should address. The context. Make sure you write down the date and time of the interview, how it was conducted, for example, over Zoom, in person, over the phone, the name and the title of the person you interviewed, the school they work in, and the grade level with which they work. So make sure you get all of that information. Talk to them about the students. How do they work with specific students? For example, how do they assess students? Do they work with behavior management issues, learning issues, social skills? What do they do specifically with students? Find out about the nature and contact that they have with families. How frequently do they interact with families? How do they communicate? Do they call families? Do they hold group meetings with families? Do they attend child study meetings? What is the nature and contact with families? What specific issues have they seen in adolescence? Alcoholism, drugs, bullying, depression, anxiety, suicidal tendencies, you might think of others. How do they work together with teachers and other professionals in their school? How do they collaborate with the classroom teacher? What role does the administration play in their work? What would they want you to know about adolescence as a beginning teacher? And finally, a reflection and conclusion. A reflection is different than a conclusion. In a reflection, you're thinking about what you've learned and writing about that. So here are some questions to ask yourself. What surprised you? What would you like to learn more about? What will you take specifically into your own classroom in the future as a result of this interview assignment? You end with references. This should be matching references to your 3 or more citations. During the interview, you're going to take lots of notes. Ideally, you're going to come with your questions prepared, and then you'll take notes under the questions. Make sure your questions address all of the topics we just discussed. Later, you'll write your interview up as a narrative case study. A narrative case study tells a story about your interview, so you don't just type the question and then the answer. You write it as if you're telling a story. I interviewed Mrs. So-and-so on such and such a date. Mrs. S described how she works with students. She said, that's a narrative case study. Pay attention to verb tense when you're writing this assignment. If you're describing things that she said or in her interview, you use the past verb tense. So Mrs. S described, Mrs. S said, because the interview is in the past. If you're describing something that she said she did every day, though, you might switch to present tense. So for example, Mrs. S described how she works with students. Notice described is in the past tense because your interview is in the past, but she works every day with students. So that is a present tense verb. Once you finish your paper, which should be 3 to 4 typed pages, remember double space. If it's a little short or long, that's okay, but that's a guide, 3 to 4 typed pages. Proof it, and then submit it to the link for the draft on the course site. I'm not going to give you a grade on the draft, but rather I'm going to give you feedback using the draft rubric that you see here. So I will say to you, this is what your grade would be if you don't make improvements. So I'll say the context, you might get developing because you left some information off. Students, how they work with the students, maybe you described that really well, so you might get excellent there. Families, same thing. So I'm going to give you some comments and some feedbacks on your draft of what your paper would be. Here's a continuation of the rubric for the draft. Did you describe the specific issues that adolescents work with, that she works with adolescents? How does she work with other professionals? What does she want you to know? What does what did you learn from this experience? Here are your references and citations. Finally, I'm going to look at your paper in terms of 2 additional things. Did you write well? Did you use APA format? Were your mechanics good? And was your paper organized? Did you have a title page, page numbers, spacing, headings, paragraph structure, all the things we talked about when we talked about APA format and writing? Once you get my comments back, you can begin on your final paper. Just a note, you cannot skip the draft process. Even though it's not getting a formal grade, you can't submit a final paper until you've submitted a draft. Your final paper is due March 14th. That gives me a week to grade them and you a week to make the corrections. And here, what I'm trying to do is to get you to pay attention to my writing comments. So I'm going to be looking at your revision and I'm going to say, did you address everything that I asked you to address? Part of learning to write, as I've told you before, is to go through a revision. So you must take your paper, review my feedback, and make the changes I suggested. As you're making the changes, try to understand why you're being asked to make the changes. At the end, you'll compose a writing reflection that is a few paragraphs long. I'm going to score this final paper, and this will be your grade, using mostly the same rubric with a couple of things added. I'm going to go through that. One thing, though, to note before I talk about the rubric is the way I'd like you to submit this revision. Please leave all my comments in place, leave the original grading rubric in place, leave everything in place from your draft. Save that to your computer. Make your changes and highlight your changes in some way. So for example, you might change the font to red. You might use the highlighting feature. I should be easily able to see my comment and how you addressed my comment. If I get back a clean paper, I'm going to return it to you and ask you to follow the process that I just described. So here's the process again. Open the draft that was returned to you, save it as it is to your computer, review each comment that I made in the margins one by one. Consider why I asked you to make the revision. If it's a grammatical or writing issue, you could use 12 little rules that we did to help you. Or just read it back and see if you can understand the change. If you don't understand something, email me for clarification. Then make the changes. Your grade on the final assignment will be based on how well you made these revisions. Don't just make spelling and grammatical changes. Those are easy. Consider the more substantive instructor comments about content. So for example, if I asked you to write a more extensive reflection, you should do that. Compose your writing reflection. Now this is different than the reflection you wrote in the draft. Your writing reflection is asking you to think about what you have learned about the writing process, whereas the assignment reflection focused on what you learned about counseling from the assignment. The writing reflection says, what did you learn about your own writing? The questions for you to answer are at the bottom of this screen. What surprised you about going through this editing process? What did you learn about writing by going through this process? What did you learn about yourself as a writer by going through this process? And what are 3 things you can do as a writer to improve your writing? This should be tacked on to the end of your interview assignment, your final paper. Save your file and submit it to the link for the final assignment in the Major Assignments folder. Here's the rubric I will use to score your final assignment. You can see much of it looks the same. These first 4 rows are exactly the same. All of this is exactly the same. Until you get to the highlighted part, rows 11 and 12, the rubric is exactly the same. So if you make no changes on your original draft on the final paper, then you can expect exactly the same grade. Row 11 asks, did you make the changes that I recommended to the original draft. If you made all or almost all the changes, you'll get full credit there. If you skipped a bunch, you might get partial credit. If you didn't make any changes, you'll get no credit. And the last row is the writing reflection. Did you write about and answer all 4 of those questions in a detailed and thoughtful manner? That's it for this assignment. Any questions, please feel free to email me at nhalbrenner.mercy@mercy.edu or through the course system. Have a great day, everybody.